right, well, we are going to continue along, and our next presenter is one of the authors of Eye Tracking and User Experience Design, one of the books we have on sale, and she'll be over at the table after this. You might want to check that out. She is from Arlington, Virginia, but has just made the long and interesting move to work at Facebook in San Francisco. So please welcome Jennifer Romano-Bergstrom.
Thanks, Joe. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So I like to start off with this because I hope that after our discussion today, this is how you will feel. This is how I feel after Dan's talk. I thought that was awesome. So I'm here to talk to you today about unbiased methods to understand the user experience. Before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about my path and how I got here and why I'm here talking to you about this today. I'm originally from Connecticut, so I started my path at Central Connecticut State University, where I went to undergrad, and I thought I was going to school for business. That's what I was into. That's what I was interested in studying. But then I kind of stumbled on psychology through some elective courses and fell in love with it, worked with my advisor on some research, and really started to like the research approach and understanding human behavior and conducting experimental studies and reducing confounds and biases and things like that. Then I went on to Washington, D.C., went to grad school at Catholic University, where I got my master's and PhD in applied experimental psychology. So this is really where it all solidified. And I did some work on cognitive aging and successful cognitive aging, things we do through our lifetime that help us age better. While I was there, I dabbled in bartending. I think I was pretty good at that whole user experience, if you will, right? You have to have a good user experience to keep people at your bar. I was runner-up second best female bartender in Washington, D.C. in 2008. During that time, I also did an internship at the Census Bureau. And after my internship, I stayed on for a couple years, and this is really where I got into usability. I was in the usability lab, which the way it works there, as with a lot of agencies and companies, all different groups at the Census Bureau, when they wanted something tested, they came to us. So they essentially hired us to test their products. This is where I really learned a lot about surveys, of course, testing websites, forms, all sorts of things that are coming out of the Census Bureau. It's also where I got into eye tracking. They had an eye tracker, and they were creating heat maps and gaze plots and not really doing in-depth analyses. So, you know, with my background with experimental design and stats and everything, I really started getting deep into that type of data. From there, I moved on to Forrest Marsh Group, which is in Arlington, Virginia, a small, it's about 70 people, research firm, a social science research firm. And I started a UX lab there and left behind an amazing team. We did a lot of government work because it's in the DC area, but also some non-government work. Again, forms, websites, surveys. This is where I started getting into mobile and doing eye tracking with mobile, eye tracking on paper, some pretty fun, interesting things. While I was there just last year, Joe mentioned this, Andrew Shaw, who's here as well, he and I put out this book. We corralled a bunch of eye tracking experts and created this edited book. He and I also wrote a lot of it. But that was a very fun project. We have a bunch of them out at the book sale, so if you have a chance and want to flip through, I invite you to. Also heavily involved with the UXPA, the User Experience Professionals Association. Our conference, I tweeted about it, our conference is in June in San Diego. So I invite you to check it out, uxpa2015.org. And as Joe mentioned, I'm now at Facebook. I just moved to San Francisco. It'll be 2 weeks ago tomorrow. So I'm loving San Francisco, loving Facebook. I'm not going to be talking about Facebook. I'm still in orientation and learning about all the fabulous things Facebook is doing. But I'm excited to continue doing UX research and eye tracking and all these fun things at Facebook. So this is my background. This is where I'm coming from, my experimental background, my psychology background. And as I got into the user experience and usability, I've really taken all of that, the fundamental experimental background, and applied it to the user experience. And I'm really interested in reducing biases because, you know, when we're doing experimental studies, what we're interested in is finding out if there's a real difference or finding out the real truth. So you need to reduce all these confounds and all these biases to be able to accurately say that there is a difference between, for example, design A and design B, or in, group A and group B and the way they perform. So it's really important, and in my experience, I see a lot of UX practitioners who don't really pay enough attention to reducing those confounds and reducing those biases. So hopefully by the time you leave here today, that'll be something that's on your mind. So how many people here have observed usability or user experience testing sessions? And how many have conducted them as a moderator or maybe as a researcher? Maybe you're not moderating, but you're in the back room, but you're intimately involved with the study. And how many of you have introduced bias to your studies? Oh, I'm so happy. Okay, oftentimes I'm not happy that you've introduced bias, but that you've openly admitted it, because we often do, even myself, and I'm, very cognizant of it, but of course we are introducing bias all the time. But I won't continue to ask those questions throughout to say who's done this and who's done that. But hopefully, as we cover some of these, you'll be thinking about some things that maybe you've done or that you've seen that, there was some bias introduced that maybe you weren't fully aware of before. So just to get this out there, bias is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. So the way we interact with our participants when we're conducting sessions, the way we ask questions, the way our body is angled, if we're smiling, if we're not, if we're saying, great, good job, versus not saying anything at all these things have the potential to introduce bias, introduce prejudice in favor of a design or a group. If you're acting a certain way with one participant but not necessarily with another participant, that all has implications and can affect your results. So certainly the way we ask questions impacts answers, and let's take a look at this little video.
So he's going to say something new and radical in the broadcast.
What, that silly grand design? Bernard, that was precisely what you had to avoid. How did this come about? I shall need a very good explanation.
Well, he's very keen on it.
What's that got to do with it? Things don't happen just because prime ministers are very keen on them. Neville Chamberlain was very keen on peace.
Yes, he thinks it's a vote winner.
Ah, that's more serious. Sit down. What makes him think that?
Well, the party have had an opinion poll done. It seems all the voters are in favour of bringing back national service.
Well, have another opinion poll done showing the voters are against bringing back national service.
We can't be for it and against.
Of course they can, Bernard. Have you ever been surveyed?
Yes. Well, not me, actually. My house. Oh, I see what you mean.
Well, Bernard, you know what happens. Nice young lady comes up to you. Obviously, you want to create a good impression. You don't want to look a fool, do you?
No.
No, so she starts asking you some questions. Mr. Woolley, are you worried about the number of young people without jobs?
Yes.
Are you worried about the rise in crime among teenagers?
Yes.
Do you think there's a lack of discipline in our comprehensive schools?
Yes.
Do you think young people welcome some authority and leadership in their lives?
Yes.
Do you think they respond to a challenge?
Yes.
Would you be in favour of reintroducing national service?
Yes. Oh, well, I suppose I might.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course you would, Bernard. After all you've told you can't say no to that. So, they don't mention the first 5 questions, they publish the last one.
Is that really what they do?
Well, not the reputable ones, no, but there aren't many of those. So, alternatively, the young lady can get the opposite result.
How?
Mr. Woolley, are you worried about the danger of war?
Yes.
Are you worried about the growth of armaments?
Yes.
Do you think there's a danger in giving young people guns and teaching them how to kill?
Yes.
Do you think it's wrong to force people to take up arms against their will?
Yes.
Would you oppose the reintroduction of national service?
Yes.
There you are, you see, Bernard. The perfect balanced sample. So, we just commissioned our own survey for the Ministry of Defence. See to it, Bernard.
So the way we ask questions impacts answers. The order in which we ask questions, the speed with which we ask them. One thing here too, there's a lot of yes/no questions. I try to refrain from those during when we're questioning our participants, so we can get more information rather than just the yes/no. So there's a number of self-report measures that user experience practitioners use. I would say that the self-report measures are used the most. These are just a few of them. I've never seen a usability study or user experience testing where they're not using some self-report measures. These are really important. It's people's perceptions of their experience, right? It's what they think about their experience. So things like difficulty ratings after people complete a task, asking them how difficult it was, satisfaction ratings, maybe after the session is complete, at the end, asking about various aspects of the experience. Think aloud protocols often used, so while people are conducting, while they're in a study and completing tasks, asking them to have running commentary of their thoughts. Sometimes a retrospective think aloud where after the session's done, you can have a video replay and show people what they were doing and then ask them to think aloud about what they were thinking while they were completing tasks. Debriefing interview at the very end of the session, go back in and have a more casual conversation about the experience or specific things people said and did during the session, and then very specific probing. So again, something somebody said or if they missed something, asking them a little bit more information about that. So here are some examples of difficulty ratings and how we might ask participants about their difficulty in completing a task. So how difficult was it for you to complete the task? Who thinks this is a good way to ask this question? Show of hands. How difficult was it for you to complete this task? Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't really go that way because we're pushing them to think about difficulty per se. And if they don't have any difficulty, it's kind of hard to answer this question. How about, was the task difficult for you to complete? Okay, you guys are awesome. Also not a very good question. It's also a yes-no question. So if they say yes, you have to follow up with another question. So why ask 2 questions to begin with? How about how easy or difficult was the task to complete? This one's actually not bad because you're giving both ends of the spectrum, how easy or difficult. So sometimes, like if you do use A, how difficult was it for you to complete the task? Accidentally, you can very easily turn it around and say, or how easy was it to complete the task? So again, we want to make sure you give both ends of the spectrum. And then how about D? Please rate your difficulty in completing the task. And you give a scale. How's this one? Good. Yeah, again, you're giving the participant a range so they can look at this and decide in this scale, where am I in this scale? I also like to use rating scales because it gives you a sort of quantitative data point for the difficulty, and especially if you're doing iterative testing where you're going to have multiple rounds of testing, you can compare across those different iterations. Or if you have different designs or different tasks, you can compare across them. How about think aloud protocols? So we often have concurrent think aloud protocols. I mentioned we also have retrospective. How's concurrent think aloud while completing tasks? So people are completing tasks and they have a running commentary. How's this methodology? Good? Yeah? It's a good methodology. I think so too. This is really common, and you get really rich data from your participants, a play-by-play of what they're thinking while they're working. However, Erica Olmsted-Hawala and I have done some work on the effects of Think Aloud protocol on usability metrics. And we have found a difference between, well, when people think aloud, their efficiency, their time to complete tasks goes up. So it depends on your objectives. If you really need a pure measure of performance and you need that time on task, then you want to be cautious about using concurrent think aloud because it may interfere. I still find that data is really rich and we use it a lot, but often when I use concurrent think aloud, we don't report time on task. So it's just something to be aware about. How about retrospective think aloud while the participant is watching a video replay? Does anybody favor this? Yeah. It's used a lot, especially among eye tracking practitioners because they're concerned that concurrent think aloud interferes with eye tracking. In my experience, retrospective think aloud just doesn't give you really rich data. So for example, in one of our studies, we had people watch a video replay where they're watching where they looked, and they get so excited about watching their eye tracking that they focus on that. And they say things like, oh, neat. Oh, wow, I looked there? Oh. And then you're asking them, what were you thinking here? And what were you thinking here? And what were you thinking here? And all they say is, I was looking for, whatever they were looking for. And then they pause and say, I'm still looking for whatever it was. Whereas with concurrent think aloud, you really get the play-by-play, like, I'm looking for contact information. I can't find it. Geez, where is it? Oh, it's usually up here. Where is it? You lose all that when you're doing retrospective think aloud. How about retrospective think aloud without video replay? Just tell me about your experience completing this task. Not really helpful. I mean, try to tell me what you were thinking just, 5 minutes ago. Never mind 10 or maybe at the end of the session. I definitely don't recommend that. And how about a mix? This is kind of my new methodology. If you have the resources, if you can recruit enough participants where you can do both concurrent and retrospective, this is my new way of thinking about it. Of course, it depends, again, on objectives and budget and time and lots of other things. But if you can get a mix, then you'll get the really rich data from the concurrent Think Aloud, and you'll get the more pure behavioral data from the retrospective because they'll be working in silence. And then how about probing? So let's say your participant does something or says something really interesting. Would we probe while they're completing the task? Or at the end of the task? Or at the end of the session? We don't want to do it while they're completing the task. We don't want to interfere with what they would normally do on their own, right? When you stop them mid-task and say, wait, why'd you do that? Or why didn't you click on that? Or why did you click on that? You're now interrupting what they would normally do on their own. So we don't want to do that. At the end of the task, you're running the risk of doing the same thing. You might call their attention to something on the screen that they didn't already pay attention to, and now you may affect the tasks that come after that. So really, I recommend waiting until the end of the session. Take those good notes, and then at the end of the session, when you're conducting your debriefing, at that point, you could go in and, you're done collecting your I don't want to say real data, but your behavioral data, right? So now at this point, you could go in and bring up a page and say, I noticed you hovered your mouse over here and you never really clicked. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And now you're no longer impacting the behavioral data, the behavioral results, but now you're still getting some more of that in-depth information, the in-depth data. So interrupting obviously interferes with natural actions, and this isn't just for usability tests and user experience research. This is something that also comes from cognitive interviews from eyewitnesses. So let's take a look here.
The next thing, it got more violent.
It's not very loud.
Well, the reason we've asked him to do a free recall and we don't interrupt is so that he's using his own words and his own memory.
This geezer was doing all the swearing, dived on top of him. And I thought it was just pummeling him like, it seems to be pummeling him like that.
If we were to stop him or ask questions and stop that flow, it becomes a stop-start thing, so there's no fluidity to it, and it becomes quite disjointed.
And so he said, he's bleeding, he stabbed him. I couldn't believe it, something like that happened, in front of you, just sitting there.
After 10 minutes, Eddie's free recall draws to a natural conclusion.
So you want to let people talk about their experience on their own. We don't want to interrupt. We don't want to introduce bias by interrupting and interfering with what people would say and do on their own. So self-report data is great. As I said, it's the most common used. It's the easiest to collect. It's asking people what they think, whether it's concurrent Think Aloud or satisfaction ratings or some probing, debriefing interview. It's super easy to collect, and it's really rich. It's people's perceptions about their experience, but it's not enough. We don't want to rely solely on what people are saying. Let's take a look at another video.
You're walking through a public square. You're looking around and suddenly see a friend in the crowd. The friend recognizes you, but even though you for a moment is looking right at him, you do not recognize him. Only when your friend stops and says hello do you realize you just looked right at him and somehow you still missed it. This is because you can only think of one thing at a time. You cannot mentally focus on more than one task, no matter how good you might think you are at multitasking. People are capable of switching between several tasks very quickly though, which can create the illusion of multitasking. We can also learn to do something physical while focusing on another mental task, such as walking and talking on the phone at the same time. However, a study was done with these very circumstances which made it clear that people who talk on their phone while walking bump into other people much more and doesn't really notice and or remember things happening around them. This phenomenon is called inattentional blindness.
So while you all may think you multitask really well, something suffers, right? We're not good at completing multiple tasks at the same time. So even though we have our participants think aloud while they're completing tasks, there's some problems with that, right? So a lot of the common observational metrics that we collect, first click accuracy, task accuracy, time to complete tasks, or efficiency measure. The click patterns, what people are actually clicking on to complete their tasks, and conversion rate. So at what point during the experience are people registering for an account or signing up for the email list or whatever that point is of conversion. So we want to combine now our self-report measures and our observational measures. So would concurrent think aloud, would we have participants concurrently think aloud and measure their accuracy? Maybe. Maybe. Who thinks this is good? Okay, it's actually not bad. So in the research that we've done, think aloud does not affect accuracy. It doesn't affect the ability for people to complete tasks or not complete tasks. I kind of gave this one away already. Concurrent think aloud and time to complete tasks. That one you want to use with a grain of salt. So we do that a lot. We have participants think aloud, and we're assessing how long it takes them to complete tasks. But we have found that think aloud does interfere with the time it takes to complete tasks because it's hard to do both at the same time. So as we're talking about what we're doing, we're slowing down. We see this is even more pronounced in older adults. They're slower to begin with, and then if you have them think aloud while they're working, that slows them down even more. So again, it's not that you can't have people think aloud and collect that data, but you just want to be careful on what the meaning is of that data. You're reporting how people did in your particular study, not how people in the world interact with the website, unless people in the world normally think aloud while using the product. How about retrospective think aloud and accuracy? This is good. Retrospective think aloud, people are working in silence, right? So that's not going to affect it. Same thing with time to complete tasks. So when it's retrospective, they're working in silence. It's not going to affect any of our metrics. However, I will say with retrospective think aloud, your overall session time basically doubles because you need to replay the entire session to the participant and have them think aloud while they're watching it again. So that's something really to think about. If you only want an hour session, that means you're cutting your time for your participants to actually complete sessions way down by more than half because you need some time, to introduce yourself and then at the end to debrief. Okay, so if we have the luxuries of having a lab, we can have participants, like what's shown on the left, we can have participants sit by themselves and work on the interface. Many of us don't have that, so we oftentimes see what we have on the right. We sit next to the participant while they're completing tasks. The problem with sitting next to your participant while they're completing tasks is that your mere presence is going to affect their behavior. So for most of us, it's normal human communication. When we're sitting with somebody, we want to turn and talk to them. So what I've noticed is participants will do that. You're asking them to complete tasks, and yet they'll turn and tell you about the problem they're having, instead of focusing on the interface. They'll turn and say, did I get it right? They're looking for some sort of validation that they're doing the, quote unquote, the right thing. So yeah, your mere presence affects them. And then I've also noticed that moderators who sit next to the participant, they act differently. They tend to interact more than when they're in another room or sitting behind the participant. If you don't have the luxury of having a lab and you need to be in the same room, you could still sit just behind the participant. So you could see their screen, you're still there, but they're less likely to turn all the way around to talk to you. Erica and colleagues at Census did a study where they had 3 different types of think aloud protocols. And what they found was when the moderator is interacting a lot with the participant, and specifically coaching. And they defined coaching as saying things like, good, oh, okay, great, okay. And giving this kind of this verbal validation throughout the study. And then when the participant was having difficulties, the moderator would say things like, well, keep looking. Is there anywhere else you would click? So had this kind of coaching behavior. And what they found was that accuracy was higher and satisfaction was higher. Of course, right? The person is having a better experience in the session, but they're rating their experience with the product as higher. So you really want to be mindful of this because while the accuracy and satisfaction are higher and that might seem good, it's really not, right? Your clients are going to be happy, or your designers are going to be happy, but then when you launch and you put this product out into the real world, it's not really reflective of how people are using the product. So you really want to be mindful of that behavior of the moderator interacting with the participant. One thing that we've done, when I was at Forest Marsh, we did a lot of studies on the road where we would rent focus group facilities, get a room at a focus group facility. And what we did is actually set up these barriers. So we had this big room, and our client sat in the back room, and the moderator would sit on one side of these barriers right here, and the participant would sit on the other side. And we were able to see their screen. We just duplicated the screen. And we started off the session sitting next to them, introducing them to what they were going to do. Then we went to the other side of the barrier. And then at the end, during the debriefing, we went back and sat next to them to talk about their experience. So this was a great way to artificially make this kind of lab setting where you would be in another room, and we were able to get around that problem where people want to turn and talk to you. Nobody, they can't even do it. They can't even reach their head around the little barrier. I did this at the National Cancer Institute for some usability studies too, and we just worked with what they had. They got like a big box and like flattened it, and we were able to put that between the moderator and the participant. So you could be creative in how you do this, but definitely be mindful of your interaction when the moderator is sitting right next to the participant. It surely has an effect, and it impacts the results. So self-report data combined with this observational data is very useful, but there's a filter, the participant. So there's more we can do. When we ask people why they're making decisions, people think they're making logical decisions.
Research shows that although you want to think that your decision-making is a conscious, deliberate process, it's not. For example, let's say you want to buy a new TV. You consider the size of the TV that works best in your room, the range of TV brands you're willing to buy from, price versus quality, whether you should get a Blu-ray player, and so on and so on. But the things that has the biggest impact on what TV you end up buying happens unconsciously. Things such as what are most other people buying, or am I the type of person who always has the newest technology, or am I more known to go for shock value like getting a 120-inch TV? This is why we can sometimes feel like we know what is the right thing to do, as in trusting your gut, because unconsciously you've already made up your mind.
So we have a lot going on where we think we're making logical decisions, but actually a lot of our behaviors are based on our prior behaviors. And we don't know that. I mean, sometimes we know that, right? Habits and things like that, but oftentimes we don't know that. And when we're interacting with interfaces, people will make things up about why they're doing what they're doing without realizing that it's really based on prior behavior. As designers, we often take advantage of that and design things that behave or look similar to other designs as well, right? So we can use some implicit measures to get at more deeper user experience, So understanding the user experience at a different level. Now we're getting beyond just looking at what people are doing and what they're saying about their experience, but we're understanding other aspects of their experience that they may not be able to verbalize or they're unaware of. Eye tracking is the most common. Sometimes people do know where they were looking, but oftentimes we find that when we ask people if they saw something, if they noticed something, it does not match what we actually see in the data. So we can collect this data and then understand a little bit more about maybe satisfaction or why it took so long to click on something, why people never clicked on something. One example, this is from a study that we conducted at Forest Marsh Group for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And the way this this online form works is first you need to, and there's instructions here. Of course, we know people don't read, right? So this tells you how to use this form. You need to come over here and click on Add a School. And once you do, then more slots appear here, and then you can enter in this information. Now, of course, that doesn't work. What we're looking at here is an eye-tracking gaze plot of 4 participants, and each of these circles represents where they were looking. And you can see people aren't reading the instructions, and people aren't looking over at a school. They're going right down over to here. You have a couple people who are looking up here, but really they're going to this area here, to where there's something on the screen. It looks actionable, but they're not understanding the other things they need to do. When we ask participants about their experience using this and about their difficulties using this, people didn't say, I didn't read. They didn't say, I didn't read at a school, because that seems obvious, right? At a school with a big plus sign. Now they're going to feel stupid if they say, I didn't read that, and that's why I didn't know how to do it. But with the eye tracking, we were able to understand that that's what was going on. People just weren't even seeing it. It's not that they were looking at it and the label didn't make sense, which sometimes we find that when we look at eye tracking. But here, it's that they didn't even look at it. It just wasn't clear. So in general, before we do that, so let's talk about combining some of these metrics. Would we combine eye tracking with concurrent think aloud? Who would do that? Eye tracking and concurrent think aloud? Couple hands, yeah. We shouldn't, because concurrent think aloud can, if it's slowing people down, then that means while they're talking to you, then they're looking in different places too, right? But again, take it with a grain of salt, and concurrent think aloud is so valuable that I still tend to use it with eye tracking. But when you're reporting your findings, you're using eye tracking to display and demonstrate what people in the study were looking at while they were doing something. You don't want to say that in general this is what people do, because, of course, the think aloud isn't a natural thing. How about eye tracking with retrospective think aloud? It's good? It's good. Again, retrospective think aloud is they're working in silence, so eye tracking is good there. Eye tracking and time to complete tasks. If you're conducting eye tracking, you're not interfering with time to complete tasks unless you're also using concurrent think aloud. How about eye tracking alone? We generally don't do eye tracking studies, right? We don't do eye tracking in isolation. We're using it as a method to help us understand the user experience, and people's eyes are being tracked while they're doing something. So that's really important. When you're reporting eye tracking results, you want to say what people were trying to do. Otherwise, it's kind of meaningless, like where people were looking while they were doing what. Were they looking for a piece of information? What were they actually trying to do? So whenever I've had clients come to me and say, I want to do an eye tracking study, it's like, no, you don't. What do you want to learn? And then let's figure out if eye tracking makes sense to use and how we're going to use it and what type of analyses we're going to do. So in general, I recommend a triangulated approach if you have the resources to include some of these implicit measures. Honestly, things like verbalization analysis, so we've done this with some of our studies where we're analyzing the number of times people use negative words and positive words during the entire session. So even things like that, you can do implicit analyses without using something like eye tracking. But if you were interested in using something like eye tracking, the equipment has gone down in cost, and it's super portable and easier to use, and you can partner with people who do it. But I do recommend a triangulated approach among these three types of measures. Self-report is really going to tell us why people think they're focusing on aspects, not necessarily why they actually are, but it's why they think they are. It's their perceptions about their experience. Our observational methods these are probably the most important. It's what people are actually doing with our product. And then eye tracking is giving us more insight. It's telling us what people are actually focusing on, how long they're focusing on things, if they're repeatedly focusing on things but never clicking on it, what's gathering people's attention. So what might this look like if you wanted to design a study where you're using a number of these metrics and you want to remain unbiased? So in a perfect world, we have a whole bunch of participants. If it's something that you need some statistical analyses for, or you only have time to do one massive usability study, you certainly don't need 60 people to detect your big usability issues. I actually recommend fewer participants and more iterations if you have the time. That way you can ensure that the changes you're making are leading to improvements. Experts and novices, something to consider as well, they do perform differently. So if it's important for you to make sure that the user experience is good for both the people who are brand new to the product and the people who use it regularly, make sure that you're recruiting both types of users. And same thing with device, right? If you want to make sure your product works well across different devices, you'll want to make sure that you're recruiting people across devices. What we talked about here today holds for in-person sessions as well as remote sessions. So if you're using a product like UserZoom, one of our sponsors here today, then you know, all of this still applies to remote moderated sessions as well as unmoderated sessions, the way you're creating questions. As I said, you can have half of your participants think aloud, half work in silence. You want to make sure you have tasks, actual tasks. So some example tasks: download an app, start a message, check for new messages, delete a message. These are tasks that you can actually measure behavior. You're not asking people, what do you think about this, right? Or how would you use this? Here you're actually measuring behavior. You're asking people to do something, and then you're assessing how they're doing it, and if they can do it, and how long it takes them to do it. Some satisfaction and knowledge questionnaires. These can come at the end, so some example satisfaction items. How likely are you to use the app in the future? How valuable is the app to you? Knowledge items. You might want to assess if people understand the process and understand what they actually did. Can others see when you're online? So something like that to assess what people understand about that experience. And then our debriefing interviews. So no matter how structured you are during the study, you always want to make sure at the end you go back in. You know, if you're in a separate room, or if you're using the divider, you go back around, or if you're sitting behind them, you now come and sit next to the person. And this is really going to humanize the experience. This is time for a casual conversation about their experience using the product. At this point, we still want to make sure we're not introducing bias. So if people are saying, did I do it right? You know, we don't want to tell them, yes, you did it right. Or if they're like, show me how to use it. We don't want to then go and explain how to use it. So you still want to remain neutral, but now it's, you know, a little bit more casual and conversational about the person's experience. So you could say things at this point, some of those probes, like, you seem to hover your mouse over here often. Can you tell me about that? Tell me what you thought about downloading the app. What would make this experience better? One question I love to use is, what is the one thing holding you back from using this tool? Because no matter what you've learned throughout the entire session, now you're forcing the participant to tell you that one thing that is holding them back. And you can follow up further with that. You know, if they tell you, maybe they had high accuracy, high satisfaction, they completed tasks quickly, it seemed like everything was great. But then you get to this question, and they tell you that, you know, it's not really useful. Like, I have this other app that's awesome, so why would I use this? And that gives you a chance to follow up more. Like, tell me about that other app. Tell me what you love about that app. You know, what would make this app more like that app? And would that lead you to use this app? You can follow up a little bit further with that. One other thing I wanted to say is we want to use words like, tell me more about that. When you ask people why, that really puts them on the defensive. You know, why did you do that? Why did you click on that? People react differently than, can you tell me a little bit about that? It's kind of softer, and people will open up. You're asking the same exact thing, but you're just phrasing it in a different way. This is just a kind of table here that shows all the different types of data that you would get if you do this. So you get a lot of data. And you've got your qualitative, your quantitative. If you wanted to do some statistical analyses, then you have your half of your participants who didn't have the concurrent think aloud, and you have all this other data across all of your participants. So you could collect a lot. So just some other quick considerations before we wrap up. When we're doing iterative testing, we want to make sure that we keep our tasks and questions the same. So I highly recommend iterative testing to ensure that changes you make as a result of testing have, number one, alleviated those issues that you discovered, and number two, that you haven't broken something else. If you never test it again, if you never put it back into the hands of new users and ask them to complete some tasks, then you have no way of knowing if you've done that, right? So that's really important. And you want to make sure that your tasks and questions are the same. If you bring people back in with this revised product and ask them to do new things or ask them new questions, then you're testing something totally new, right? So you want to make sure you're keeping those the same. We can't objectively test our own designs. Too often I see the designer conducting the session, And it's impossible to remain unbiased. It's hard enough when it's not our own design, right, to like stay neutral and sit behind the person, not laugh when they're saying something funny. And now when it's your own design and they're like, oh my God, I hate this, designers want to jump in and be like, oh, well, what about this? What about that? We cannot possibly objectively test our own designs. I can't stress this enough. I recently observed a designer who was running a session, and he went on to, oh, actually, this is the next one. Our job is not to explain the product. He went on to tell the participant, well, let me tell you why I created it that way. And he went on to explain, what it was supposed to do, and that's not our job. Our moderator's job is to pull as much information as possible from the participant, not to explain how it works or how it's supposed to work or how we thought it was going to work. Usually what I say when a participant asks if they got it right or what they're supposed to do, I usually say, what would you do if I wasn't here? And they quickly learn that they're not supposed to ask you. If you say that a couple times, they'll stop asking you what they're supposed to do. You just say, what would you do if I wasn't here? And if they really push, you could just say, let's talk about it at the end of the session. And then, again, like after the debriefing, maybe when you're walking them out or something, you can have that conversation, when they ask if they got something right or something like that. Another thing I often say is, we're not testing you. You're helping us to test the product. People don't really realize that. They still feel like they're being tested. I mentioned coaching. If you're going to be coaching, if you're going to be telling people they're doing a great job, if you're going to be leading them down a path, and it's really a waste of time, a waste of resources, because the data that you get is really not valuable. They're going to feel great, and the designer or your client is going to feel great because it looks like the product is performing really well, but it's not an accurate measure of the user experience. I already talked about this, social validation, pleasing the researcher, acing the test. No matter how many times we tell participants that we're not testing them, they still feel like they're being tested and they want to get all the answers right. So sometimes we have to tell them, we're not testing you, or there are no right or wrong answers. I always have that in my initial introduction, that there are no right or wrong answers. Sometimes you have to stress that. And then age-related differences in performance. I mentioned that I've done some work with older adults, and we have found that older adults perform differently, and that's even when we're controlling for their internet experience and their computer experience. They still are performing differently, and I'll just show you a quick example. This is for a given task on this website at the Census Bureau, a little bit archaic website. We found that younger adults in completing this task, this is an eye tracking heat map, so across all the participants, the red spots are the areas where people looked a lot. And the young adults used the center area and then the left navigation. We found a similar pattern with middle-aged adults. They also used a little bit on the right. Older adults only used the center. And this was an experimental study that we conducted after we noticed this happening in study after study after study, where older adults kept going to the center of the page even when they weren't getting the right answer or the right path. They weren't able to find what they were looking for. They kept going back to the center. So we designed an empirical study to actually see if this was a real thing that was going on with a large sample, and we found that it was. And like I said, this was controlling for their internet experience and computer experience. So it's related to natural age-related cognitive decline. So you want to make sure that if your product is intended for everyone or for older adults, you want to make sure that you are including them in your research because they do perform differently. And if you create something that works really well for young adults and middle-aged adults and you forget that entire demographic, then when it launches, they're going to have a lot of problems with it. So, my big question for you, are you ready to be unbiased?